Prospect House Media.
And now, prepare yourself for the only weekly podcast you won't want to miss. Welcome to the Ameritocracy Show with Troy Edgar, live from our studios in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
Hey everybody, I am Troy Edgar and welcome to the Ameritocracy Show. Thank you for tuning in and checking it out. It is greatly appreciated. This podcast examines the conditions for personal and economic growth and opportunity across America. This week, I met with Chip Fulghum, CEO of Endeavors and former Deputy Undersecretary of Management and Chief Financial Officer at the Department of Homeland Security in my LA studio. Following his 28-year Air Force career, including 3 Pentagon tours, Chip retired as a colonel before transitioning into leadership roles within DHS. Our conversation centered on our shared experiences in the DHS CFO role, emphasizing the significance of the DHS Undersecretary Management position and challenges associated with filling Senate-confirmed roles in government. With many vacancies and crucial roles, we contemplated whether the 13 federal department CFO roles should remain as Senate-confirmed positions. In this episode, Chip shared his servant leadership philosophy and importance of prioritizing the needs of those you lead. Additionally, he talked about his work as the CEO of Endeavors, highlighting the nonprofit's mission for aiding communities in crisis and their veterans programs and partnership with the Cohen Veterans Network. I hope you enjoy. Good afternoon, Chip. How you doing?
Great, man. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, man, I'm super excited to have you on the show. I really appreciate it.
This is going to be awesome.
Yeah. So you're usually in Texas. You're here in LA, visiting out here, and so I really appreciate you taking a couple of minutes of your time out here of your trip.
Yeah, we are out here at the Cohen Veterans Network. It's their annual conference. They support us a great deal, serving veterans and their families. So we're out for a conference for a couple of days, and I was happy I could stop by.
That's awesome. Hey, just for the audience's perspective. One of the reasons I'm super excited to have you on the show is, not only are you the CEO for Endeavors, which is a group or an organization that helps people in a disadvantaged situation, homeless, a lot of different populations. But you and I kind of have a unique history together. Both of us are Senate-confirmed CFOs for DHS, and your experience at DHS even went much further, having the opportunity to be the Deputy Undersecretary of Management and a couple of times the Undersecretary of Management and the Deputy Secretary of the department. So the vantage point is going to be really awesome. But the one thing, though, that I would just say to kind of put the listeners into a little bit of where I'm coming at from an appreciation is at the very beginning of our relationship, I'd had the opportunity, to meet with the president. I had met with Kirstjen Nielsen, who was the secretary at the time, and given the opportunity to come and be potentially the CFO. And so they said, hey, why don't you come out to Washington, D.C. So I flew out there from L.A. and would like you to meet a couple people. And so I get out there, and this is when the Homeland Security was not at St. Elizabeth's new campus, but it was up at the NAC, which, when you go to D.C., you're thinking everything is right there when you're a neophyte. But the NAC was quite a ways out of northern, D.C., pretty far up there. And anyway, when I got there, I had the opportunity of meeting you and Claire Grady. And, it was interesting. It's just my first kind of really direct connection into the department. And you were very gracious. You were very helpful in the process. You kind of knew, somebody coming into this whole thing kind of fresh, you were very helpful. And so I just wanted to tell you thank you. And then from that part, I think once I made it through Senate confirmation, you've acted as a real mentor to me. So I just really appreciate that.
No, I appreciate you saying that. I'm just glad we didn't run you off that day when you got up to the NAC, because it is a different place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could tell when I got there, and I think the secretary was actually in a different room while we were kind of going through, and there was something going on, as there always is now that I've been in the department. And you guys really represented the front office with Claire Grady being the undersecretary of management at that time, but possibly in the acting deputy role.
She was. So her and I just kept going back and crossing paths down the hall. I was the acting deputy. She got confirmed. She went in to be the acting deputy. I went back to being the acting USM. So we did that quite a bit together.
Yeah, yeah. So, what I wanted to do on this show is kind of explore a little bit of your experience through leadership and your career and your transitions. I do a lot of work with veterans, and something that we get a lot of feedback from on the show is wanting to get stories of veterans that successfully transitioned into different careers. And so, I think from your perspective, your career will be really interesting to those folks. And then really just looking at a little bit of our shared experience at DHS. We both sit back now. I'm very proud of my time there. I think it was a great experience, and I'm very supportive of the organization. And I know, as are you, even when you were out, you would come in and do speaking engagements to help staff in different parts of DHS. And like I said, as a mentor. So, but there's a couple things that policy-wise that I thought would be interesting for the listeners as like two insiders looking at DHS. We're not directly involved anymore, but we look at this, and I always want to leave places better than what I found them. And so when I look back and I think, okay, maybe this dialogue will have some interest to people that potentially serve after us. If you wouldn't mind, Chip, just a little bit of your background and experience of what got you up to the point where we're at today, where you're now the CEO of Endeavors, and maybe just let the listeners in on your journey.
Sure. I started at the Citadel, and I had no intention of going in the military. I never even thought about it. Didn't know anything about the military. They offered $100 a month, and $100 is bigger than zero. And so I took it. It was a 4-year commitment, and that 4 years turned into 28. I was incredibly fortunate to work in the places I worked and serve in the places I served. Served in the Pentagon 3 times. And that experience, more than any other, really taught me how government works, at least on the DoD side.
Can I ask you a question about the Citadel? So,
Sure.
When you get out of the Citadel, or you went into the Air Force, is that? I'm not familiar, other than I know it's a great school to get people ready. But what do you basically have a choice of what branch of service you go into when you get out?
So the Citadel is one of the last 2 publicly funded military schools left, state funded.
Yeah.
And you don't have to go in the military. You do have to take ROTC. So you have to take ROTC to graduate. About half the graduates go into the military, about half don't. But they have all 4, all branches of service except the Coast Guard.
So what drove you towards the Air Force?
I thought the Air Force, one, I liked the service from a technology standpoint. And it was a pretty cool looking service, right? But they really had a focus on leadership and leadership development. Not that the other services don't, but that was the one area where I thought they were a little bit ahead. And I was really fascinated by learning more about leadership, how to be a better leader. So that's why I went that direction.
Let me ask you a question. When you went into the Air Force, being a previous Navy guy myself, when you go into the military and you start, you're really unclear like where you're going to end up. I've had Mark Fedor on, who was an admiral in the Coast Guard, and he kind of went that direction, ends up into operations, running and being a skipper of a boat. Mm-hmm. And his story was, I loved that so much, but I knew at some point he kind of had to move out of the operations and up to an administration and get away from the fun stuff. In the Air Force, a lot of different roles out there. You could be directly out there in logistics or the fleet doing different stuff, or within the branch of service. But how did you end up in finance?
So it's funny. I actually thought I was going to go to law school. I got into law school, and the Air Force at the time had told me, if you get into law school, we'll let you go. And then a new guy came in and said, I don't know what that guy told you, but you're not going to law school. You're going to go into personnel. So I started in personnel, but actually I was the non-appropriated fund accountant for the base and with a history degree. So go figure. But I had enough business where they thought I qualified. So I did that, and then I went into controllership, and I stayed in controllership for probably 24 to 28 years.
Wow. Yeah, and then you had a lot of commands. You started to talk through some experiences at the Pentagon. How was that working at the Pentagon?
So it's funny, the first time, I'll tell you about that, first time at the Pentagon, I get there, and I'd only been at base level. So you have base level, you have sort of the MAGCOM level, which is like a regional headquarters, right? And then you've got the air staff. So I get there, I don't know anything about the Pentagon or what goes on up there. And the first day, I show up, and they put me in the section that runs the database. I don't know anything about computers. They're talking a foreign language to me. And then they kept talking about the omnibus. And so when I went home that night to talk to Cheryl, my wife, I said, you know, they are fascinated about the bus schedule here. I don't understand.
Oh, that is funny.
Yeah, because that's how little I knew about what went on up there. I learned. I had some really good folks. I had a guy that sat beside me. His name's Vern Simmons. And without Vern, I wouldn't have survived. But Vern helped me get through the first couple of years up there. And then I sort of got the hang of it and ended up going back again and then another time.
Yeah. And when you get to 28 years, where did your final assignment what were you contemplating? Like, hey, I'm done. I'm ready to move on. Or was the last assignment just something that just didn't strike you? What was going through your mind?
So I had worked for General Al Flowers. He's the longest serving airman in DOD history, 46 years of service. And I was out at Randolph in San Antonio. I was the CFO for the command. Thought this was going to be my last assignment. I was happy with that, happy with my career and what I'd done to be able to serve. He calls one morning at 6 o'clock and he says, Chip, I need you up here. So what are you going to tell Mr. 46 years of service other than when and where, and I'll be there? So I ended up going back up there, running Air Force budget programs, which is the whole FIDEP of the budget. I did that for a couple of years. I really could have done one more assignment. And then one Friday night, someone called and said, hey, there's a budget job over at DHS I think you might be qualified for. Why don't you think about it? And so I said, okay, what is DHS? And from there, I figured it out, and I applied.
So you got out of the service, you started at DHS. Just so I could clarify this, did you actually start in the budget director job?
So I started as the budget director for the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah. So I've made comments on the show, and I'll just say it for the pleasure of this episode, is like, as a CFO of DHS, I thought that job was the house of cards job. That job had, there's a CFO that sits in the seat, and there's whoever is the budget director can really make or break you. And when we talk a little bit more about the policy of the CFO Act and the intentions of why a CFO is political and not, and why they're not political, and the components is like the budget director, their relationship with the appropriations, or the four corners, in both in the Senate and the House. And their relationship with the examiners from OMB. I didn't realize it when I first got in, but I'm a little bit of a quick study. I realized I need to have a partnership with that budget director. So you definitely came into probably one of the hardest jobs I think that there is in this office of the CFO. That had to be like drinking through a fire hose when you first got there. Yeah,
it was pretty interesting. When I got there, we had averted shutting down by 30 minutes. At 11:30 at night, they signed the bill, and that was when sequestration was just starting, which no one thought would ever happen, but it did. I didn't understand sequestration. I didn't understand the department. It was a complex agency. It had like 76 appropriations. In DOD, we never dealt with OMB, very rarely. And then the whole relationship, as you said, with the Four Corners was quite unique. We actually needed to improve our relationship with the Four Corners. So all of those things were coming at me at one time, plus the fact that you not only work for the CFO, you work for the Undersecretary for Management, you work for, at the time, the Chief of Staff was really running the budget. You work for the Secretary, and then, of course, you got the OMB folks as well as the folks on the Hill. So a lot to swallow on a daily basis.
Yeah. As you got into being the budget director, there, and again, just to kind of place some marks, because, with the 20-year history, you actually are a really important part, because 2001 gets formed in November and a month after 9/11. So, when people have spent 5-7 years there, those are major parts of the history. So you got there 2012, if I remember correctly. Things started happening based on my knowledge, because, like I said, when you're the CFO, they have this wall and it has all the pictures of the CFOs, and so you could kind of see everybody that has been in that role. And I know you've done much more than that, but like I said, you definitely have stepped through. Can you start to talk about a little bit of the progression? The acting CFO role, you end up kind of coming from the budget director, and then things just started happening. And when I see your experience at DHS, it seems like things kept kind of coming, but the beginning of that.
Yeah, I would say the first 5 to 6 months were incredibly hard. The Deputy Chief of Staff was a wonderful person, but she was incredibly demanding in terms of, and knew the budget better than anybody in our budget shop. So we had to work really hard to get up to speed. But we did a pretty good job. We got us through sequestration. And then as far as the acting thing goes, Peggy Sherry was the CFO. She called me down one day and said, "Hey, I'm going to another agency. I don't know what they're going to do, but I'll be leaving in a month." I didn't think much about it. And then one night about 6:30, Chris Kaminsky called me. He was the acting undersecretary at the time. He says, "Hey, they want you to be the acting." And I said, "Well, don't they have someone else?" And he said, "No, they want you." So I said, "Sure, I'll do it." And little did I know, you always need to read the fine print, because in the fine print of that, 2 weeks later, I had to go testify in front of Congress about why we couldn't get a clean opinion. And I paid no attention whatsoever to that side of the CFO business. The budget business was keeping me quite busy. So I had to get schooled up on that. And then we just went from there.
So, again, kind of setting the stage for potentially your Senate confirmed role is so unlike me, I came in through political door, and and I have more Fortune 500 corporate restructuring experience and stuff like that. But you came in as a career person, so you actually kind of reserved your spot as a career, and then as you kind of worked your way through. Talk about the unique opportunity that pops up of potentially, starting to have an interaction with the secretary, which at that time was Jeb J, right?
Secretary Johnson.
Johnson.
I mean, one thing I tell people all the time, Troy, is that every day is a job interview. Just because you're not walking around with your resume every day doesn't mean it's not a job interview. So I'd never met the secretary, even though he used to be the general counsel for the Air Force, and then he was the general counsel for DOD, but I'd never met him. He was going through his confirmation process. Part of that, he needs to understand the budget. So I went over to see the secretary, and he starts the conversation with, "Look, I don't know anything about budget. You're going to have to talk to me like I'm a fifth grader." And I went, "Okay." And he goes, No, I don't know anything about budget. You're going to have to talk to me like I'm a fifth grader." And I said, "Well, my folks talk to me like I'm in middle school, so we'll be just fine." So I talked to him, explained it in real simple terms, and it's not a simple budget, but got up, left, didn't think anything of it. And after he got confirmed a couple months later, he called me in his office and said, "Hey, I talked to the president, and we want to nominate you to be the CFO for Homeland Security." And I looked at him and I said, "Do you want to know who I voted for or anything like that?" And he goes, "No, I just need you to do the job." And so I said, "Yes, sir," and began that process.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think people that aren't in the inside or aren't into politics, pray that decisions are made like that within government, especially for very important jobs. I think the budget when you were there was $50 or $60 billion, and by the time I was there, it was $90 billion. And so, there's that enormous weight that you want to be a good shepherd for the taxpayer money for that organization. But as you're going through now, your Senate confirmation there's two types of Senate confirmation for the CFO. It's a privileged nomination, so you can basically go through, fill out everything they want, submit all the information to the Senate. They'll administratively push you through, and then if everything's fine, there's a cutoff of after 10 days, then they send it over to be put on the executive calendar, and you could be voice voted through, never have any effect. I think you might have had that process.
Did.
And I didn't.
You did not.
No, mine, on day 9.5, Senator Rosen from Nevada pulled my confirmation and sent it back to be having hearing. And then I got to go through that prep for the hearing. And then, so that process took a while. And it was, but something, Chip, is again, maybe just professionally, maybe it's my faith too. It's like, I think I wished it didn't happen because I would have liked to serve more, but I think it made me better. I had the opportunity, you go meet all the senators, they set up all these meetings, you go meet with folks. And, you realize, there's a lot you don't know, and you get to start to build some relationships, even on both sides of the aisle, like, just going out there. And I think, and it also made me have to study and get ready for some hard questions. So it really was like a great preparation. So I think the process, I don't even know it took so long, but do you, from your perspective, I mean, how from the time you were submitted to the time that you actually were confirmed, do you remember how long that ended up taking?
So I believe it still took about a year.
Did it? Yeah.
And what's interesting is that Russ Dio was behind me as the nominee for the USM. Mm-hmm. And I got, as you said, voice vote. He was on the next docket to be approved, and then he got pulled. And so that's how I ended up being the acting USM, is because he got pulled, and it took another 6 months to get him in. Oh. But to your other point about really getting to know the members, one of the things that I was very fortunate to get to do was to go around with Secretary Johnson. A couple of times, the government shut down. One time we were isolated. Everybody else had an appropriation. We didn't have an appropriation. So he decided to take to the halls of Congress, and he took me everywhere with him. And so that was an incredible learning experience for me to watch how he worked both sides of the aisle and to watch how they interacted with him. It really gave you hope in government that, okay, I know you're over here and I'm over here, but trying to work together and see the other person's point of view.
Yeah. Just one last thing. I think I'll just kind of bring it up because we're here, as I thought was really an interesting experience is like the senators when I was going through for the state of California was Dianne Feinstein. And, I spent 12 years as a mayor in my city and city council, and also the county at the state and the conservation agency. So I would do a lot of lobbying. So I had great opportunities to meet with Senator Feinstein. And so, she was very nice through the process. But it was funny. It's like when you actually get down to the Senate vote, you can watch the vote happen on C-SPAN. I'm here in California. And in the Senate, it's not like they push a button and say yay or nay. They have to come down and go thumbs up, thumbs down. And it was brutal because, as each senator walks up to the booth and, which way Senator Feinstein looks up and she's like, no. And I'm like, oh, my God, I thought I had a relationship with her. And then I still got like 62 votes. So I had 10 or 11 on the other side, but it was interesting. You personalized it a little bit because I met most of these people, and then that they're going to vote the way they're going to vote. So it was just a different experience.
So that's interesting. You say that. So we would go into a couple of Republican senators' office and talk to them. Very cordial, very nice. 15 minutes later, going, there is no way I'm voting for an appropriations bill, and you're like, that's politics. Yeah. And they got to do what they got to do.
Yeah, it's a different scenario. So talk about you. A couple of your quick turns of kind of you've talked with like Russ Deo when he ended up kind of going through. When I intercepted you, there was a lot of stuff going on at the end. With Kirstjen Nielsen was the secretary, and I recently talked to her. She said to tell you hello.
Oh, good.
Yeah, she's a big fan of yours. So I remember after I was announced and starting to go through that Kirstjen had been, or Secretary Nielsen had been basically she had left. And then something we'll talk about in a bit here is the way that DHS is set up. It has a line of succession, and that undersecretary of management job is really critical for a couple different reasons. It's number 3 in the organization, and then as a kind of an org strategist guy, from my perspective, like it policy-wise automatically fleets to deputy or secretary without anybody doing anything. It's the way that policies are put in place, especially if that is a confirmed person, they move up. And, Claire Grady, who was the undersecretary of management. So once Kirstjen left, and at that time, I don't believe there was a deputy secretary, right. It created a forcing function. And so as soon as Kirstjen left, then there was probably some discussion with the White House and, what are we going to do at DHS, and whether the discussion with Miss Grady and whether she would stay, do what she was going to do. And so a week later, she stepped down because that line of succession was not the way people wanted it to be. I'm not sure who. And then you were in there acting undersecretary of management at that time. And so there was a lot of dynamics. And I said there's a couple of reasons why that undersecretary of management job is important. And we'll get into this in a few minutes. But the two things that I see is really critical is, number one, that job is probably the most senior business person in the room. It is. Russ Deo came, unbelievable. He was also a mentor, just like you with me. He was very helpful. Fortune 500 executive, C-suiter. That job, just like you, needed to know how to manage big things like large organizations. And you can do a lot of stuff policy-wise, but you need to know how to run a business. And that job is important. And then if you don't have a secretary, deputy secretary, which by statute is supposed to be the COO, then you really don't have. So you got a secretary that's trying to get stuff done and makes commitments and tries to move the needle, but without having an execution arm or an operational, very difficult. And so I just thought that was interesting. Like at that point, the instability that I saw walking in, and then pick that up from where you were at. Like after Miss Grady left, where did your role come out in that, and that fluctuation point?
Yeah, so I'll back up a little bit to the end of the Johnson administration. So Russ finally got confirmed, and when Russ got confirmed, he said, I'd like you to stay as the deputy undersecretary. The secretary would like you to stay as the CFO, so we'd like you to do both things. And I said, okay, I'll do that. And Russ had about 15 months to go in that administration. That time went by fairly rapidly. About 4 months prior to the end of that administration, the deputy secretary left. He's now the Secretary of Homeland Security, but he left. And so Russ fleeted up, so I became the acting USM again. At the end of the administration, the secretary at the time recommended 3 people remain at DHS in political jobs. Myself, Pete Neffinger, and Russ. The new administration took that advice and said, thanks, but no thanks. And as you said, there's a line of succession. I was number 18 as the first career guy. The 17 people in front of me were all political. And so they were all asked to leave. And so there I sat as the now acting deputy secretary because, thankfully, John Kelly got confirmed. And so he comes in that first day and goes, I'm John Kelly, who are you? And I said, well, I'm Chip Fulghum. I think I'm your acting deputy secretary. And he goes, yep, good, let's go. And so for 4 months, I acted as the deputy. Then Elaine Duke got confirmed as the deputy secretary. I went back to being the acting USM. And then when Claire got confirmed as the USM, John Kelly went to go be the chief of staff and took Kirsten with him. And so Elaine moved across. Claire literally walked down the hall the day she was sworn in and became the acting until Kirsten came back as the secretary. When Kirsten left and Claire left, it was about the time I had already decided I was going to go to Endeavors, but I stayed as the acting USM. The TSA administrator came to be the acting deputy, and Kevin McElwain became the acting secretary. But during that whole time, there was a lot of chaos. It put that administration to me at an incredible disadvantage because they couldn't get people confirmed. Good people like you couldn't get confirmed. They were always having to go to the number 2 or 3 person down to act. And it just didn't give a lot of stability for the department to do the things that they wanted to do in that administration. And so I always thought that Kelly had it tough because he couldn't get people confirmed. Kirsten had it very difficult because she couldn't get people confirmed. And then you just went through a series of acting folks from McElwain to Wolf. And it was just tough on that administration.
Yeah. Through that process, Elaine Duke, another person I would consider as a mentor is, the thing that I realized in the service of DHS, especially in the political realm, is each of those people reached out like directly, and it didn't matter what party. And they said, look, this is my personal phone number. I will help you in any way to be successful and anything I can do. And, and Elaine was another one that just, really quickly like jumped in. I had some issues going on with the Coast Guard, and I was trying to build a relationship, and I was trying to compare what I was seeing versus what I was hearing. And, it was very helpful to get Elaine's perspective, really fast to get me up to speed. So, as you're learning, you also need to listen a lot and try not to start doing stuff until you actually know everything. So talk about, so you at the end of DHS and Endeavors, I will say a little bit of a story. Hopefully it's not out of school, but I remember even you and I kind of going through a discussion when I was coming to the end of my time at DHS. And I said, Chip, I have a bunch of companies and sold them. I'm probably not super focused on needing to work. I've got some great job opportunities with some of the big consulting companies. And I was just kind of curious, from your perspective, what, and you and I sat down and you're like, Troy, you're really involved with charities. Why don't you consider nonprofit work? And I think my reaction at the time was, I am involved a lot with charity work. And I think the hardest job for the charities, because I'm on a lot of boards, is the executive director or the CEO, because the board above can be helpful or really hard to manage. And a lot of times it's not like a Fortune 500 board where these people know what it's like to sit in the seat and they bring, everybody's bringing what they bring. A lot of times the charity boards aren't staffed the same way. Over time, if you get a good executive, they help form the board and shape it and get the right skill sets, but sometimes it could be leaning too hard one way or the other. And I just didn't know if I'd have the patience to, with my background, to be wading through that and knowing, like, when you have information and need to make a decision, sometimes you make, this is my opinion, this isn't Endeavors, but sometimes you don't always make the right decisions because you don't, quote, have the votes on the board to do it. And so I was just curious, from that story of kind of giving me advice, you end up at Endeavors. Can you talk a little bit about Endeavors and, your role now as the CEO of that organization?
Yeah, so I'll tell you how I got there. All I ever knew was service, right? First military service, then public service. And it was sort of our little family business. It's just all I knew. And I'd begun to think about, well, maybe I want to go and do something like you had done, right? Go in the private sector and do that. And I remember having about a 4-month conversation with the former chief of staff. And he kept telling me, come on, I want you to come over here and work with us. And at the end, I told him no. And he looks at me and goes, I knew you'd say no because you're in this service thing. And, endeavors just happened on me. Remember, I talked to you about General Flowers. Yeah. So General Flowers is on the board of Endeavors. He was the chair of the board. Endeavors does disaster recovery work as one of their pillars of service. And they were having some issues with FEMA. So he calls me one day and says, hey, can you help them? And I said, well, I probably can't help them, but I can point them in the right direction. So the CEO came up there at the time. We had a conversation. I'd served with him before. And at the end of it, he looked at me and said, you ought to come out and see what we do. Mm. And I'm like, yeah, okay, right. Because I never thought I'd leave DHS. And so about 3 weeks later, we got connected again. And he said, I really want you to come out here. And so I went out there and I saw what they were doing for homeless women who suffer from mental illness and their families. I saw what they were doing for veterans and their families, helping them with mental health issues. I saw what they were doing with disaster recovery. And it was a faith-based organization. It had been around for about 50 years at the time. And went back home, talked with Cheryl. We prayed about it, and it just felt like we were being led to come there. So we picked up, left our grandkids in Virginia and our daughter in Virginia, and we moved to Texas.
And that's in San Antonio.
It's headquartered in San Antonio.
Yeah, because last time you and I met in person, we were in El Paso, and I remember, you were talking about some of the stuff that you were doing and how it was going. It's interesting as like even preparing for our discussion today, I was doing just a little bit of research on Endeavors just to kind of see, the organization and I thought if I was ever going to revisit that board thing, just like, it seems like you had a lot of great leaders on the board. And then kind of going through some of the public disclosures, and this drives the charity boards that I'm a part of crazy now, is I'm the finance guy. So I join boards usually because I want to make sure I feel comfortable where my money goes, because I don't, I'm providing funding too. But it was interesting is like the information provided out in the public is that, it didn't really talk about the value of the total amount of revenue or thing. It gave percentages of sources. And so, and like you said, a big part of the financials, like a 90% block of the wedge for you guys is really providing services to government as an extension of government. And, and I think, again, for your work for the veterans, I'm very appreciative, and I thank you for that. It was interesting to see, because a lot of times those types of groups also depend on a lot of philanthropy, and you've been able to get that profile to being a personal philanthropy, and so I was just kind of curious, being a part of the board, your job is to kind of make sure the funds are coming in as well as operate. How do you balance those two roles? Because you got such an important mission, you really can't be always looking up to the board and looking out to the donor group or the agencies to try and build relationships. You got an important mission going on underneath.
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit more about Endeavors. Sure. We are, as I said, a faith-based nonprofit. We've been around for 55 years now. And, we were founded in the basement of a church. And we were founded because an individual had perished on the steps of the church, a homeless individual. And the pastor at the time, Dr. Louis Zabendon, came to the church, and he had a choice to make, right? He could, say, man, this is really bad. We need to pray about this, and go into the church and do, quote unquote, the business of the church. Or he could go, maybe it's time for us to refocus ourselves and do the business of the church out in the community. He chose the latter. We formed our organization, formed several other organizations. And from that, we've grown into what we are today. What we are today, I believe, is first and foremost, we still have that same heart for service. We still know what our why is. And our why is remembering every day that individual that perished on the steps of the church, and that we were put here to serve others, the most vulnerable in need. And what we've seen is that the government wants to provide those services, but they don't have enough capability to do it. So they look to organizations like us to help them get the homeless back into housing, to help provide those mental health services for not only veterans and their families, but active duty as well as we're doing a lot for first responders now, particularly Customs and Border Protection, who unfortunately have one of the highest death by suicide rates in all of federal law enforcement. Not unlike what's happening in the veteran population, where we are still losing on average 22 veterans a day to suicide. And so, we are committed to doing all we can to slow that down and eventually stop it, right? It's just tragic that we're losing folks like that. And then, like I said, we do a lot to help the government with long-term recovery as well as response in terms of disasters, whether it's a natural disaster, a humanitarian crisis, or the pandemic. During the pandemic, we responded. We operated the Dallas Convention Center for 6 months. We operated several facilities in El Paso. So we did a lot in terms of response and still do a lot for response. But all of that is based on who we are. And who we are is an organization that's committed to providing that helping hand to every client, every time, in every community we serve. If we can do that, we'll be just fine, right? And, you've got to balance that with the business side of it, right? So as you know, because you serve on nonprofit boards, they're a for-profit in every way, shape, or form, except we just take all the money and invest it back into the organization. But it's got to function like a business. So we have a very strong infrastructure that does that. But what I like to tell our folks is that 51% of the vote's going to go to serving the client every time. We'll figure the financial piece out, but we're going to serve wherever we're called and wherever we need to be.
Yeah, I didn't realize when I was doing my research, the veteran population in Texas, number 2 to California.
And soon to be number 1.
Yeah. And, going down there, definitely a lot of areas that you guys are trying to kind of branch out and support.
Yeah, when you look at veterans, it's one of the things we've done is taken a holistic approach to behavioral health and wellness. We built the first privately funded wellness center in San Antonio based on 6 principles of wellness. They're not rocket science, but they're incredibly important. Not only mind, body, and spirit, but financial issues weigh on veterans and their family. Making sure that we bring the environment in because that has such a healing effect. The knowledge piece of understanding, okay, what is happening to the veteran and how can they begin to get on the road to recovery. And then connectedness. Veterans, as you know, are a very close-knit group. And so just having a large space where they can come in and just hang out, right? So think of it like a modern-day VFW with a different kind of bar maybe, but it's got a fitness center in it. We've got everything from massage therapy to one of the biggest issues veterans face is headaches. Severe headaches. A lot of them have traumatic brain injury, and they've suffered from that. So we have a headache clinic. We have a psychiatrist in there. We have a financial advisor in there. A variety of different services, because the further you can get left of an event, whether it's, a divorce or not talking to my kids anymore or things of that nature, the further left you can get them on the path towards wellness, the better off you are. I really call it a suicide prevention center because that's what it is. You mentioned El Paso. We're about to build a 41,000 square foot facility. It's under construction now. It's not only going to serve veterans and their families, but it's going to serve first responders and federal law enforcement, in particular CBP, because we took that model. We showed it to Customs and Border Protection. They like what they saw. So we're doing a demonstration pilot out there right now. Same principles, just in a storefront versus a big, giant facility. And to date, we've served over 1,200 Customs and Border Protection personnel and their families.
Yeah. No, I like I said, I knew just through our discussions what you were doing, but I was through preparation for this interview, I really was impressed. So again, I just want to thank you for all the work that you guys are doing there. It's really noble stuff. And what I wanted to do a little bit, Chip, was, it's pivot a little bit to the policy of DHS. We've established, your Air Force career, the DHS. We've talked about a little bit of the trials, tribulations, opportunities. and then shifting into endeavors. But I think what I want to do for what the time remaining is kind of two areas that I'm kind of interested to get your take on. The first area was, a little bit, and I'll put both these in a category called, policy, which would be, the Undersecretary of Management dilemma would be the first one, which is the way it's orchestrated and the potential impacts. And the second one would be looking at the roles within government that are Senate confirmed and the deadlock right now, if you're following, of all the Senate confirmations, that the CFO role has become one that has been targeted as asking the question of whether that should be Senate confirmed. But so first, just looking at the Undersecretary of Management dilemma, to set a little bit of the staging to get a reaction from you, just like we talked about, that mechanism that somebody that is confirmed in that role is the number three, and potentially, if you don't have a secretary and a deputy, actually starts to work its way up. Even this current administration under President Biden hasn't. They put up Mr. Valdez, but they did not follow through with that nomination. But the same type of thing is that you look at is like that because of the structure, potentially with succession plan. It seems like that job would be really critical and isn't being able to be filled. And I know in the last administration, maybe it was the fear of the succession plan automatically actually gives you a new secretary that you may or may not want. Is this something from a policy perspective that you would see taking on through the succession plan, or do you think that that would really make a difference? It's just a hard job to find because it's like the highest business level person. And so maybe it's not the political people that you would normally see in these policy jobs. It's actually somebody like Russ or you that's had this big, large scale experience, and maybe it's just hard to recruit. What do any suggestions on the USM dilemma?
Well, first of all, I believe very strongly they need a Senate confirmed USM in the job. They are, as I think we talked about before, they run the business of the department. And for the secretary to be successful, he's got to or she's got to have a USM that is laser focused on making sure that the agenda of the secretary and the administration is being carried out. And a big part of that is how the business operates. And as you know, budgets set policy. Mm-hmm. We like to think that it's the other way around, but it's not. And in that department in particular, you drive policy through budget decisions, and the USM has that responsibility. So I believe very strongly in that. I also believe very strongly that you need a career deputy because you need someone there for continuity. And Tex has been doing that job a long time. He's been doing it well. But I think he'd be the first to tell you he'd like to have a Senate-confirmed USM, just like no one was happier than I when Russ showed up and when Claire showed up, because you need both positions and both need to be strong.
And Chip, just for the listeners, so that we're not too inside baseball, so Undersecretary of Management or USM, talk a little bit about the scope of that job, just so people kind of understand really what we're talking about here.
Sure. So they have responsibility for the human capital operation in the department, obviously the CFO, the CIO, the procurement officer. They're the acquisition authority for the department. They have the logistics function for the department. They have the personnel security for the department. And all of those lay the foundation for allowing the department to do the missions that it does. So it has an incredibly expansive portfolio, but it's one that is vital to the mission of the department.
What I had seen in there, and you mentioned Tex Alice, the general, another great mentor for me when I came in there. Just to give the listeners an idea of how that role functions in a practical sense is the crisis on the border. And when you have 28 components across DHS, you got to have somebody that kind of can put all the pieces together. And so the job that I saw, Tex do, or he was the deputy undersecretary of management because there was not an undersecretary. But was to really cross-coordinate between all the components because they all have confirmed leaders that think they have a direct channel to the White House And sometimes they fully listen to the secretary, and sometimes they want to do their own thing. So it's like a bunch of cats trying to herd in a direction. They all have the right intention. Their viewpoint is very valid, but the secretary is trying to drive an action, and so somebody has to kind of coordinate that. And so that's what we're talking about. And I just wanted to put it out there and make sure people understand how important that job is.
Yeah, I would say what I called the USM was the Undersecretary for Mediation on most days because, to your point, that he could convene or she could convene and get folks from across components. Because what I found is they all agreed on the mission, right? They wanted to do the mission. It was just how to go about getting it done. And the USM was in a unique position to pull folks together to try to get people moving in the same direction, to pull on the rope the way the secretary wanted the rope to be pulled. So you're dead on. But yeah, it was Undersecretary for Mediation on a lot of days.
Well, good. And then, hey, the second topic, like I said, I wanted to talk a little bit about was, that the Senate confirmation. So for CFO, so in the hierarchy, the CFO is kind of directly reports to the Undersecretary of Management, and then kind of has a dotted line to the Secretary. And that's debatable. If you don't have people in those roles confirmed, like I did, I had an opportunity to work a lot with the Secretary's office and the deputy. But by design, you would have the Undersecretary of Management helping the CFO. But the question that is starting to come up in D.C., and I know you get asked these questions. You and I both belong to the Partnership for Public Service. And one of the things that I do of contributing to that is through the CFO part. And I think you're on the management part of that. But we are trying to help policies going forward. The issue of it's hard for departments to get Senate confirmed leadership. So they go for big periods of time without the people being able to get confirmed. Senate confirmation positions or nominations are different levels, 4, 3, 2, 1. And 1 would be like a secretary, and 2 might be the deputy, and you kind of go through. One of the, I would say, areas of opportunity that they talk about is the office of the CFO. Do you really need to have a CFO be Senate confirmed? What's the value? And it's a practical question, and then it's a question of policy. And on the practical side, it's hard enough to get people confirmed, but it's so low on the poll. Like it took you a year, it took me a year, a little over a year. So as designed, the job's not always getting filled. And if you look even today, currently across government, in this current administration, but it's not a whole lot different under President Trump, was that the CFO's jobs were not filled on a routine basis. So people are like, hey, maybe we should look at that role as being a career or a presidential appointee, not Senate confirmed. And if you look at what governs that is the CFO Act, which is a regulatory, it's a law that was passed 1990 that says 14 of the 22 department agencies need to have their CFO be Senate confirmed, and they list the reasons. And so the practical part is it completely makes sense if you had everybody staffed. But I guess I was curious from your perspective of, do you think departments at the HQ level need a confirmed CFO just to start out with as a base principle?
Yeah, so I'm going to start a little broader than that, and I'll get to what you asked.
Sure.
I would say that my experience was there are too many political positions in the components. You have to go 3 or 4 levels down to find a career, and when administrations change or folks leave, that becomes a very difficult task in terms of maintaining the continuity inside the organization. Like when we had the administration change, you had to go way down to get to me. You had to go way down to get to a career guy in FEMA and a career guy in the other components. So I do think that there needs to be a balance there. As far as the CFO goes, look at what the CFO's role is. You mentioned he or she works for the USM. They also have a line to the secretary. They also deal with the upper echelon in OMB. They also deal with our fine friends on the Hill. Yep. And so being political in the sense of being confirmed gives them, I think, a leg up in terms of their credibility with the Hill, their credibility with OMB, and access to the inner circle of the department. That said, it takes too long to get them confirmed, and as you said, they're on the lower ring of the totem pole. And so that Stacy, who we both have worked with and is the acting CFO of that department,
Stacy Marcotte.
Marcotte has been the longest serving CFO in the department's history. And she'd be the first to tell you she'd like to see a CFO come in. So if they can't fix the process to get the political CFO on board faster, and maybe they don't need to be Senate confirmed, maybe they could just be a political appointee. If they can't do that, then I agree that they need to go back to being career.
Can I ask you a question? So I've talked to, on this show, I've talked to a couple of different CFOs, and sometimes I'll sneak this one in, but with you, I'm being very direct. The thing that's interesting with your perspective, because one of the suggestions I've been making to people when I've been kind of asked to talk about this to them on the Hill is, combining the USM and the CFO into one role. And, if you look at like the State Department, there's some case studies, or not case studies, some examples of where that has worked to make the role, kind of uniform together. And so I was just kind of curious, because and I'm asking you because you had served in that type of a capacity, or is that too much for one person? But it'd be a lot easier to confirm one person, a super USM CFO that's got the dual responsibilities and can act in that. Or do you think the USM job is just so overwhelming, even though we haven't filled it for 4+5 years? But, so what would be your take on consolidating roles?
So since I did it for well over 6 or 7 months and then did it again multiple times, there is some merit to what you say, because the CFO understands all the other lines of business inside USM pretty well because they resource them. Yep. So they have to know a lot about them. And given the fact that the CFO is already a Senate-confirmed folks, in some ways, I think the department looks at it as sort of the first among equals already. I think you could maybe even take that job and combine it with maybe the deputy undersecretary's role, because I did that too. Because the deputy really runs the day-to-day business of the USM, I think you could do both, but you'd have to have a Stacy Marcotte as your deputy CFO. Yeah. And as you said, you got to have a strong budget director. Like, I was fortunate to have Alan Bloom. We had Jeff, who was on your show before, as the deputy budget director. But you really have to have a strong team underneath, which they do today.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I just wanted to kind of get your take on that and see. Hey, Chip, as we get ready to close, and just kind of parting words for the listeners, like I said, you've got a very unique background. I was just curious, when you look at leadership, and you said in some interviews that, again, as I was doing my research, that your perspective on leadership has gone organic. As you've gotten to different levels, you're looking at kind of a shifting perspective on maybe the principles of what makes somebody a successful leader. And I guess after I started the show by saying you ended up leaving the Air Force and going at the budget director job, and the next thing you know, you're at the top of DHS. It was always you're the best guy, let's have you do this. Not necessarily they recruited you, it's just you were in the right area. And you said something earlier in the show is you just never know, just do your job. Anything you would leave for the listeners or people that are in their career, and that, every day is just another day, or is every day an opportunity for something really big?
Yeah, I think every day is an opportunity. I tell people all the time, you always get opportunity. You may not get the same opportunity, but everyone gets opportunity. It's what you do with it that matters. I do believe performance matters. I have really gotten to a place where I just truly believe in servant leadership. And, you hear that a lot, right? Servant leadership and servant leadership. But to me, servant leadership means 3 things. First of all, it's about sometimes people need a hug. right? People need compassion. People need to see you show them empathy and grace. Sometimes people need, sort of a whooping, right? And not a whooping. I don't want to get in trouble with HR or anything, but what I mean by that is sometimes you just need to, you got to be firm but fair, right? I heard someone today talk at the conference I was at that said, be tough but kind. But the third thing's the most important, and it's not about you. And, it's about the people that you have the privilege to lead. And so you just sort of got to flip the organization upside down and go, I'm here for them. And I think if you take that approach every day or try to, I think you can be successful. I've been very fortunate. I had a boss one time that told me, he goes, Chip, it's better to be lucky than good. And you're lucky quite a bit. And I'm like, yeah, luck, I think luck has something to do with it. Luck and timing obviously have something to do with it. But then it's what you do with it that matters.
Right. Yeah. No, Chip, I really appreciate it. And like I said, I'm honored that you took the time to come on the show today. And I always love to be able to catch up with you. So thank you so much for coming out here.
Well, thank you, and thanks for your service at DHS and what you're continuing to do to help those in need today.
Great. Thank you, Chip. Thanks again for joining me today on the Ameritocracy Show. Be sure to follow me on social media and our website at troyedgar.com, where you can get more information and sign up for my weekly email. I hope you have a great week.